Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we examine development through the lens of gender. Last lecture, we discussed the many social and economic facets that change as countries develop, but the role of women also changes. Development is not gender neutral. The impacts of development affect women and men differently. Generally speaking, as countries develop, there is greater gender equality, meaning that men and women have equal access to opportunities and resources. Gender has an impact on many of the social and economic measurements we looked at last lecture. For example, women with more education tend to marry later and have fewer and healthier children, thereby influencing both total fertility rate and infant mortality rate. And globally, secondary education rates for girls have been steadily rising in the 21st century. And in some developed countries, like the United States, women are enrolling in college at higher rates than men. But often, when a country has high gender inequality, women are expected to take on traditional roles of raising children and working within the home. This limits the economic prospects for the family, the community, and the country. Improving levels of development can help to ensure equal opportunities for women. The widespread availability of electricity and the increased use of labor-saving appliances can reduce women's domestic labor time, even in areas where traditional gender roles persist. This can allow greater opportunities for girls to get education and for women to work in the formal sector. The Gender Development Index helps to examine these characteristics because it looks at gender disparities in the three basic dimensions of the Human Development Index. Because there is a lot of gender inequality regarding women's health, income, and education, it can mean that women's productivity is severely limited, as well as increasing their vulnerability to exploitation and human trafficking. Regardless, when gender inequality is high, it can hinder the economic advancement of a country. Which is why the perhaps most important metric to evaluate gender inequality is called the Gender Inequality Index, or GII. Again, gender equality is an indicator of greater levels of development, and thus gender inequality corresponds with lower levels of development. The GII evaluates reproductive health, female empowerment, and labor market participation. To begin the discussion on reproductive health, we examine the maternal mortality ratio, which looks at the number of mothers that die during childbirth for every 100,000 live births. Maternal deaths are often the result of inadequate care before, during, and just after childbirth. And while the MMR fell 38% in the beginning decades of the 21st century, two regions, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, still account for almost 90% of maternal deaths worldwide. The other reproductive health factor is adolescent fertility, or birth rate, which examines the number of births from girls between the ages of 15 and 19. Early childbearing can present health risks for both the mother and the infant, and also serve as an obstacle for young mothers in accessing higher education. Again, countries like Niger, Mali, and Chad in Sub-Saharan Africa have the highest adolescent fertility rates, while countries in Western Europe like Switzerland and the Netherlands, as well as countries in East Asia like South Korea and Japan, have some of the lowest. The empowerment metric of the Gender Inequality Index examines the gender gap in receiving some secondary education. It examines the male and female rates of secondary education by age 25. Roughly 16 million girls will never set foot in a classroom, with nearly 9 million of these girls living in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, women account for 2/3 of all adults who are illiterate. The other empowerment metric is the proportion of women present in national parliaments. It should be noted that many of the other metrics of the Gender Inequality Index, like education, reproductive health, and income, are closely associated with and tend to open more opportunities for female political participation. Representation in national parliaments can allow women greater say in public policy matters such as health and education, so there's a strong feedback loop associated with gender inequality. The share of women holding parliamentary seats has increased over the past 25 years to about 24% at the global scale, but women are still underrepresented. In Northern Europe, the average is around 40% of parliamentary seats being held by women. The United States has 149 women in our most recent Congress elected, meaning our rate is about 27% of our national parliament being occupied by women. But Yemen, Oman, and Haiti have less than 3% of female representation in their national parliaments. The final aspect of the Gender Inequality Index is labor force participation rate, which compares men and women and their participation in the economy. The variation between these two rates is often more pronounced in countries that practice distinct gender roles. Core countries usually have more women working in full-time jobs outside of the home, often in the tertiary sector, which may require a college education. But in periphery and semi-periphery countries, women mainly engage in primary and secondary sector work, or engage in work that is part of the informal economy. But as an interesting side note, the female labor force participation rate is lowest in countries that are generally middle-income countries, like those in the Middle East and North Africa. So now let's understand the importance of the Gender Inequality Index. The Gender Inequality Score indicates the percentage loss in potential human development due to gender inequality. So for example, Guatemala has a GII score of 0.493, meaning that there is a 49.3% potential loss to the human development due to gender inequality. By contrast, Sweden's composite score is 0.044, meaning only a 4.4% loss to Sweden's development. Essentially, the closer to zero, the greater gender equality between men and women. And the higher the number, the more gender inequality. So gender equality is highest in Europe, and inequality is highest in West Africa and Southwest Asia. That is perhaps the biggest takeaway from this conversation about gender inequality. Western Europe typically ranks at the top and Sub-Saharan Africa at the bottom. But the Middle East is a semi-periphery region generally, and economic indicators are often on par with many of the core countries of the world. But when it comes to social indicators, and especially gender equality, the Middle East often registers near the bottom. To build on the Gender Development Index and the Gender Inequality Index, let's examine gender disparities in employment opportunities and wages a little more closely. A recent United Nations report noted that 104 of 189 countries have laws that code jobs by gender, meaning that more than half of all countries have jobs that are labeled as men's work and women's work. And we've already discussed that in many areas, women are expected to handle domestic duties, childcare, Or if they work outside the home, it's often in the informal sector. So there are many challenges beyond just gender-coded work. But many jobs that are coded as women's work, women are often paid less, a topic that we're going to discuss more shortly. But in many developing countries, women often work in agriculture or manufacturing. In fact, many new manufacturing sector jobs in periphery countries are considered women's work. Nearly 3/4 of new manufacturing jobs in garment, toy, and electronic assembly plants are occupied by women, in part because they are paid less and because women are considered more dexterous. And this can be seen as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it increases women's opportunity to participate in the formal economy and to achieve greater economic independence. But on the other hand, those jobs tend to maintain existing gender disparities. Wages are low, working conditions are often repressive, and job security is minimal. And there are challenges in core countries as well. Of the world's 500 largest corporations, only 5% are headed by women, and only 27% of all chief executives are women, regardless of the size of the company. Women are underrepresented in higher level managerial positions, as well as in quaternary and quinary sector jobs. So let's now shift gears and discuss the gender wage gap. Jobs coded as men's work earn higher wages. Even if women find employment in male-coded jobs, women earn roughly 80% of what men do for the same work. What this means is that women consistently earn less than men, regardless of the type of labor they do. And at the global scale, women earn between 20 and 32% less than men. But developed countries typically have smaller pay gaps than developing countries. So that means it's a good indicator of development, right? Well, generally, yes. We can see a divide between MDCs and LDCs. But between core and semi-periphery, there isn't much of a divide. And there are plenty of outliers. Notice semi-periphery outliers like Mexico and Saudi Arabia. Also notice periphery countries like Mozambique, Tanzania, and Kenya. And also notice Vietnam. These countries have fairly equal wages. But there are disparities within countries as well. U.S. states like California, Nevada, and New York have more equality of wages. But states like Wyoming, West Virginia, and Alabama have some of the widest gaps between male and female wages, where women earn just 69 cents for every dollar earned by men. And Iceland has become the first country to make pay inequality illegal in 2018. At the time, Icelandic women were paid 74% of the average wage for Icelandic men. So women protested by only working 74% of the 8-hour workday. The new law requires that all jobs must prove that they pay men and women equally for the same work. So how do we address some of these inequalities between men and women? The United Nations has written several protocols and decrees for human rights and inclusion, with an emphasis on gender equality and the empowerment of women. But what does that look like? According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, there are 4 key strategies. Ensure that financial assets are in the hands of women, keep girls in school, improve reproductive health and access to family planning, and support female leadership. Regarding that first point, most women have far less access to financial services than men do. They may not have savings or checkings accounts in banks. They have lower rates of property ownership, which means that they lack collateral for securing bank loans to build small businesses. So development economists introduced microfinance as a solution. A microloan is a very small short-term loan to people with little income or collateral intended to help them establish or expand a small business. Microloans, as small as $150, can help women cover startup costs for a variety of businesses, and they can also cover education costs. In 2015, market analysts determined that an estimated 125 million people worldwide, about 80% of them were women, received a total of about 100 billion US dollars in microloans. But there have been struggles as well. Some women struggle to repay the microloans, which can sink them further into poverty. And several studies have been conducted on microloans, and none of the studies showed that the average microloan recipient was better off financially than those who did not receive a microloan. But a microloan is a very small amount, so it might not launch a household out of poverty, but it may provide them a more comfortable life. And that is where we'll leave things this evening. Have a good night, geographers.